"What on earth are you wearing, Simon?" Paul's voice thundered across the dining table like I'd committed a crime. My hand froze halfway to the wine glass, fingers trembling against the crystal stem. Everyone stopped eating. His mother, his father, and his younger brother, all eyes turned to me in synchronized judgment. My blue shirt, the one I'd chosen this morning with such care, suddenly felt like sandpaper against my skin. My old denim jacket, my comfort blanket on anxious days, now seemed like a neon sign broadcasting my inadequacy. In Paul's world, everything about me was wrong. It had always been wrong. I tried to smile, forcing my voice to stay level and calm. "I thought this was a casual dinner party." "Casual?" Paul rolled his eyes dramatically and exhaled through his nose like a disappointed teacher. "Simon, you know perfectly well that Dad invited his most important client tonight. There's a business presentation after dessert. You couldn't have dressed like some community college professor? This is my family home. We have standards." Community college professor. He'd used those exact words last week when I mentioned wanting to visit the Contemporary Art Gallery downtown. It was his favorite weapon, that phrase, designed to cut deep and leave no visible wounds. Under the table I gripped the hem of my jeans until my knuckles turned white. But I stayed silent. What was the point of defending myself? The shame was mine alone to carry. It had always been mine alone. But then something unexpected happened. A voice cut through the tension, soft yet unmistakably authoritative. "Paul." His mother, Mrs. Lauren, set down her wineglass with deliberate precision. The sound echoed in the sudden silence. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Paul attempted a casual laugh, clearly caught off guard. "Mom, I'm just saying." "I asked you a question, Paul." Mrs. Lauren turned her attention to me, and for the first time in our 3-year engagement I saw something different in her expression. No judgment. No disappointment. Just pure, unfiltered concern that made my chest tighten. I couldn't speak. My throat had closed completely. What could I possibly say? Paul cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. "Mom, I simply believe Simon should make more effort when we're entertaining guests. It's basic social etiquette that..." "Effort?" Mrs. Lauren carefully folded her napkin and placed it beside her plate, her gaze never leaving her son's face. The disappointment in her eyes was profound. "Simon has made effort every single day for you, Paul. Every demand you've made, every expectation you've set, every last-minute obligation you've thrown at him. If he prefers comfortable clothing, what gives you the right to humiliate him in front of the entire family?" It felt like someone had cracked open a window in a room where I'd been suffocating for years. My heart hammered so hard I pressed my palm against my chest, afraid everyone could hear it. Paul's face flushed crimson and he glanced toward his father for support. But the older man remained strategically silent, suddenly fascinated by his steak. Paul's younger brother, Ethan, studied his plate with exaggerated intensity, clearly wishing he could disappear. "Mom, are you seriously taking his side on this?" Paul's voice carried an edge of genuine disbelief mixed with frustration. Mrs. Lauren ignored him completely. She turned to face me directly and I noticed her eyes had become glassy with unshed tears. When she spoke, her voice was so gentle it threatened to shatter every defense I'd carefully constructed over the years. "Simon, sweetheart, are you truly happy?" I stared into her deep blue eyes, so sincere they hurt to look at. She knew. Somehow she'd known for a while. Perhaps for months. Perhaps from the very beginning. That question, so small, so simple, so devastating, began dismantling everything I'd been holding together. Tears burned behind my eyes, but I fought them back desperately. I don't know," I whispered. It was a lie. I knew exactly how unhappy I was. I'd known for a very long time. The rest of dinner passed in excruciating silence. Paul's father made a few attempts at conversation about stock markets and golf tournaments, but they fell flat. The important client never materialized. Apparently the meeting had been rescheduled, making my clothing choice even more pointless to criticize. When dessert was finally served, I couldn't taste the chocolate mousse. It could have been cardboard for all I knew. I helped Mrs. Lauren clear the dishes despite her protests, needing something to do with my hands. In the kitchen she touched my shoulder briefly. "Call me tomorrow," she said quietly. "Please." I nodded, not trusting my voice. The drive home was silent. Paul gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, His jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle jumping. I watched the streetlights blur past my window, each one marking another minute of this relationship I'd been clinging to like a life raft in a storm. When we finally reached our apartment, Paul went straight to the bedroom without a word. I heard the door close, not slam, but close with that particular controlled pressure that was somehow worse than anger. I stood in the living room for what felt like hours, still wearing my supposedly inappropriate jacket, and wondered when exactly I'd stopped recognizing myself in the mirror. My phone vibrated. A text from Mrs. Lauren. "You deserved better tonight. Sleep well, dear." I sat down on the couch and finally let the tears fall. They came silently, streaming down my face as I stared at the collection of photographs on the wall. Paul and me at his company party. Paul and me at his brother's wedding. Paul and me at his college reunion. In every single photo, Paul was smiling confidently at the camera while I stood slightly behind him, my smile never quite reaching my eyes. When had I become so small? When had I agreed to shrink myself into whatever shape he needed me to be? The apartment felt cavernous in its silence. I could hear the refrigerator humming, the distant sound of traffic, the neighbor's television through the thin walls. But from our bedroom, nothing. Paul had probably put in his earplugs and gone to sleep, already dismissing the evening's events as an overreaction by his mother and an embarrassment by his partner. I pulled my jacket tighter around myself and curled up on the couch. Tomorrow I'd wake up and pretend everything was fine. Tomorrow I'd make Paul's coffee exactly how he liked it and iron his shirts and exist quietly in the margins of his life. But tonight, just for tonight, I let myself acknowledge the truth that Mrs. Lauren's question had unearthed. I was drowning, and I had been for a very long time. The only question that remained was whether I had the courage to save myself. The morning after the dinner disaster, our apartment felt like a museum of a relationship that had died but nobody had bothered to remove. Paul woke at 6 o'clock sharp, moved through his routine with mechanical precision, and left for the office without acknowledging my existence. No goodbye, no explanation, just the sound of the door closing and his footsteps fading down the hallway. I stood at the kitchen counter, staring at his half-empty coffee mug. He'd barely touched it before abandoning it, the coffee now cold and developing a film on top. I washed it slowly, methodically, watching the brown liquid swirl down the drain. Then I organized my art supplies that had been gathering dust in the corner of our spare room, the room that was supposed to be my studio but had somehow become Paul's storage space for old law school textbooks and gym equipment he never used. My life had become a series of small erasures, each one barely noticeable on its own, but together they'd rendered me almost invisible. Around noon, my phone rang. Mrs. Lauren's name appeared on the screen, and my stomach dropped. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times before I found the courage to answer. "Hello? Simon, dear." Her voice carried a warmth that Paul had never possessed, not even in our earliest days together. "Would you be able to meet me this evening? Just the two of us. I know a lovely cafe downtown, where we could talk privately." I agreed, though fear twisted in my gut. What would she say? Would she try to convince me that marriage required sacrifice? Would she defend her son and suggest I was overreacting? The cafe she'd chosen was tucked away on a quiet street, the kind of place with mismatched vintage furniture and bookshelves lining the walls. Soft jazz drifted from hidden speakers, and the aroma of fresh ground coffee beans wrapped around me like a warm blanket. Miss Lauren was already seated by the window when I arrived, elegant in a cream-colored coat and silk scarf, looking like she'd stepped out of a classic film. "Thank you for coming," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "I ordered you a latte. I hope that's all right." "That's perfect. Thank you." We sat in silence for a moment. She cradled her cappuccino between both hands, staring into the foam as though reading tea leaves. When she finally looked up, her eyes held a profound sadness. "I need to tell you something I've never told Paul," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "When his father and I were newlyweds, fresh out of college and full of naive dreams, he treated me exactly the way Paul treats you now." My breath caught. I hadn't expected this. "It started small," she continued, her fingers tightening around her cup. "Comments about my clothing choices when we visited his business associates. suggestions about how I should style my hair for company events, little corrections about the way I laughed or the topics I discussed at dinner parties. He was molding me, Simon, shaping me into the perfect accessory for his career advancement. Mrs. Lauren, please, let me finish. She smiled sadly. I told myself it was normal, that compromise was part of marriage, that love meant supporting your partner's ambitions even when they overshadowed your own. So I got quieter. I made myself smaller. I stopped painting. Did you know I used to paint? I stopped seeing friends he deemed inappropriate. I became exactly what he needed me to be, and in the process I lost myself completely. A tear slid down her cheek, and she brushed it away impatiently. It took me 15 years to find myself again. 15 years, Simon. And even now there are parts of me that never fully recovered. When I saw what Paul did to you last night, when I watched him diminish you in front of everyone. Her voice broke. I saw myself at 25 and I couldn't stay silent. I won't watch you disappear the way I did. I couldn't hold back anymore. Tears streamed down my face as years of suppressed emotion finally found release. I don't know how to leave, I admitted. Everyone thinks we're perfect together. The engagement party, the wedding plans, all our friends. How do I tell them I've been pretending to be happy? The people who truly love you will understand, she said firmly, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. And the ones who don't? They were never really on your side to begin with. But Paul is your son. Why are you? Because I'm also a person who understands what it's like to be erased one day at a time. Because I love my son, but I won't enable him to become his father. And because you, Simon, deserve to exist as a whole person, not as someone's supporting character. We talked for another hour. She told me stories about her younger self, the artist she'd been before marriage, the dreams she'd abandoned. I told her about my own art, my graphic design work that barely paid the bills, because Paul had convinced me to take only projects that didn't interfere with his schedule. She listened without judgment, without offering easy solutions, just creating space for me to speak truths I'd been afraid to acknowledge. When we finally left the cafe, dusk had settled over the city. Mrs. Lauren hugged me goodbye, holding on a moment longer than necessary. Whatever you decide, she whispered, know that you have someone in your corner. You're not alone, Simon. Not anymore. I walked home slowly, taking a route through the park I hadn't visited in months. Paul had always complained it added unnecessary time to the commute. But tonight, I needed the quiet, needed the space to think. Street lamps flickered to life as darkness fell, and I found myself noticing things I'd stopped seeing, the way leaves rustled in the evening breeze, the laughter of a couple walking their dog, the smell of someone's dinner cooking through an open window. When had I stopped noticing the world around me? When had my entire existence narrowed to the question of whether I was meeting Paul's expectations? My phone buzzed with a text from Paul, working late, don't wait up. No apology. No acknowledgement of last night's humiliation. Just an update delivered with the emotional warmth of a weather report. I stood under a street lamp and typed out a response, then deleted it. Typed another, deleted that too. Finally, I just wrote, okay. But as I continued walking, Mrs. Lauren's words echoed in my mind. You deserve to exist as a whole person. I realized with startling clarity that I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt whole. I'd been living as a fragment, a partial version of myself for so long that I'd forgotten what completeness felt like. Tomorrow, I decided, I would start remembering. Somehow, the evening air held an autumn chill as I left the cafe, my mind still reeling from Mrs. Lauren's revelations. I walked without direction, letting my feet carry me through familiar streets that suddenly seemed foreign, as though I were seeing them for the first time. The conversation had cracked something open inside me, and I felt simultaneously liberated and terrified by the possibilities spilling out. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my music library, searching for something that matched my mood. Nothing felt right. Everything reminded me of different versions of myself I'd left behind. The guy who loved indie rock concerts, the one who spent Sunday mornings at farmers markets sketching strangers, the person who used to laugh freely without calculating whether it was too loud or too much. Lost in thought, I didn't notice the figure approaching from the opposite direction until it was too late. The collision was spectacular. My phone flew from my hand, skittering across the sidewalk with a sound that made me wince. His coffee splashed across both our jackets in an arc of brown disaster. Oh God, I'm so sorry. I dropped to my knees, scrambling for my phone while simultaneously trying to assess the damage to his clothing. I wasn't paying attention, I was just, hey no, that was entirely my fault. His voice was warm, slightly breathless, with an undertone of genuine amusement rather than irritation. I was reading while walking, which is apparently a recipe for disaster. I looked up and time performed that trick it does in movies where everything else falls away. He was tall, with dark brown eyes that caught the streetlight in a way that seemed almost deliberate, like the universe was trying to make a point. His curly hair was slightly disheveled, and he wore a black hoodie now decorated with coffee stains that somehow made him look more approachable rather than less. Your phone, is the screen okay? He crouched down beside me and I caught the scent of something cedar-like, completely different from Paul's aggressive cologne that always made my eyes water. It's fine, I managed, though I hadn't actually checked. But your jacket has survived worse, trust me. He grinned, and the expression transformed his entire face. It was genuine, reaching his eyes in a way that made something twist in my chest. I once spilled an entire Vietnamese coffee on myself during a photography shoot. This is amateur hour. You're a photographer? Among other things. Professional spiller of beverages. Occasional photographer. Full-time disaster. He extended his hand. No, Simon. His hand was warm, his grip firm but not aggressive. Paul always shook hands like he was trying to establish dominance. Noel's handshake felt like an invitation rather than a challenge. We stood there for a moment, hands still clasped, neither of us moving to break the connection. A car horn blared somewhere in the distance, snapping us back to reality. This might sound strange, Noel said, releasing my hand slowly. But could I get your number? Not in a weird way, well, maybe a little weird, but I'd like to buy you coffee to replace the trauma I've just inflicted. Also, if your phone develops issues from its sidewalk adventure, I'd feel terrible. I hesitated. Every reasonable voice in my head reminded me I was engaged, that accepting phone numbers from attractive strangers wasn't appropriate, that Paul would be furious if he knew. But a different voice, one I barely recognized anymore, whispered, "When was the last time someone wanted to get to know you just because?" Sure, I heard myself say. That would be nice. We exchanged numbers, fumbling slightly with our phones like teenagers. When he saved my contact, I glimpsed him typing Simon, coffee crash victim, and found myself smiling genuinely for the first time in days. Fair warning, Noel said as we prepared to part ways. I make terrible dad jokes and have strong opinions about pizza toppings. Still want to risk that coffee date? I'll take my chances. He walked backward a few steps, nearly colliding with a mailbox, which made us both laugh. Text me when you get home safe, he called out. You know, so I can confirm I haven't permanently damaged your phone holding capabilities. As I watched him disappear around the corner, I realized I was still smiling. The expression felt foreign on my face, like a language I'd forgotten how to speak. My phone buzzed before I'd walked another block. Noel, just checking you made it 3 whole minutes without another catastrophic collision. Still standing? I laughed out loud, startling a passing jogger. Me. Barely. The sidewalk is treacherous tonight, Noel. Right? Clearly someone needs to install safety rails. Or maybe I need to stop reading while walking. Jury's still out. We texted back and forth as I walked home, the conversation flowing with an ease that felt revolutionary. He asked about my favorite bookstores, my thoughts on whether cats were superior to dogs. His position, cats were tiny philosophers, dogs were eternal optimists. And what I did for work. When I mentioned graphic design and art, he responded with genuine interest rather than Paul's usual dismissive, "That's nice, but when will it actually pay?" Noel, do you have an online portfolio? I'd love to see your work. Me, I used to. Haven't updated it in years though. Noel, why not? Such a simple question. Why not? Because Paul had said my art was fine for a hobby but not serious enough for professional promotion. Because I'd believed him when he suggested I was wasting time on dreams instead of focusing on stable income. Because I'd learned to make myself smaller and smaller until my passions could fit in the cracks of someone else's priorities. Me, long story. Maybe I'll tell you over that coffee. Noel, deal. Fair warning though, I'm an excellent listener. You might end up telling me your whole life story. Something about that statement, the casual intimacy of it, made my throat tight. When was the last time someone had wanted to hear my story? When had I stopped believing I had one worth telling? I reached my apartment building and paused outside, looking up at the window where I knew Paul was probably working. Headphones on, completely absorbed in whatever case he was preparing. He wouldn't have noticed I'd been gone. Might not notice when I returned. Noel home safe? Me, just arrived. Thanks for checking. Noel, goodnight coffee crash victim. Sleep well. I stood on the sidewalk for several more minutes. Phone clutched in my hand, feeling the weight of the day settling over me. Mrs. Lauren's words. Her painful honesty. This unexpected connection with a stranger who'd literally crashed into my life. The universe, it seemed, was trying to tell me something. The question was whether I had the courage to listen. Finally, I climbed the stairs to our apartment, each step feeling heavier than the last. But in my pocket, my phone held a new name, a new conversation, and the smallest seed of possibility that maybe, just maybe, there was still time to find myself again. The following weeks existed in a strange liminal space, like living in a house where all the clocks had stopped at different times. Paul came home from work, opened his laptop at the kitchen table, scrolled through endless emails with mechanical precision, barely touched whatever dinner I'd prepared, and then retreated to the guest room. We moved around each other like ghosts haunting the same property, present but not quite real. He stopped initiating conversations entirely. I stopped trying to bridge the silence. What was there left to say when every word felt like stepping on broken glass? But Noel? He filled the quiet spaces with light. It started with morning texts that appeared on my phone like small gifts. Good morning evolved into photos of sunrises he'd captured, accompanied by terrible puns about dawn being nature's alarm clock. Then came the memes. Absurd, perfectly timed, the kind that made me laugh out loud in empty rooms. Our conversations stretched late into the night, philosophical wanderings about whether parallel universes existed, and if our alternate selves were happier than we were. One afternoon, his message appeared. What's your favorite place in the city? I stared at the question, my cursor blinking expectantly. When had anyone last asked me about my preferences? I typed slowly, there's an old bookshop downtown. Whiskers and Pages. They have a resident cat. His response was immediate. I know that place. The cat's name is Marble, right? She once sat on my camera bag for an entire afternoon. Would it be weird if I met you there tomorrow? My fingers hovered over the keyboard. This was crossing a line, wasn't it? Meeting someone new, someone who made my heart race, while wearing another man's engagement ring. But that ring had started feeling less like a promise and more like handcuffs. Tomorrow at 4? I typed before I could overthink it. Perfect. See you there. The next day, I arrived at Whiskers and Pages 5 minutes early, my stomach performing acrobatics. The bookshop smelled like old paper and possibility, its narrow aisles crammed with floor-to-ceiling shelves that leaned at precarious angles. I found Noel in the poetry section, completely absorbed in a slim volume with a burgundy cover. When he noticed me, his entire expression transformed. Simon, come look at this. He held up the book reverently. Pablo Neruda. Original Spanish on one side, English translation on the other. Do you read poetry? I used to, I admitted quietly. Haven't in years though. Why not? I shrugged, unwilling to explain that Paul had called poetry pretentious navel-gazing for people who can't handle real literature. Noel seemed to read the answer in my silence. He returned the book to its shelf with care. Let's get some tea, he suggested. The cafe section here makes this incredible Earl Grey with lavender. We settled into worn velvet chairs that had probably been there since the shop opened decades ago. Marble, the shop's gray tabby, appeared immediately and claimed my lap as her throne. Noel laughed, the sound genuine and unguarded. She's extremely particular about people. You should feel honored. Animals have always liked me better than humans do, I said, stroking Marble's soft fur. I find that hard to believe. We talked for hours. He told me about photographing a wedding in Iceland where the northern lights appeared during the ceremony, about backpacking through Vietnam and learning to make pho from a grandmother in Hanoi, about the freedom of living untethered to expectations. I found myself describing the paintings I used to create before I convinced myself they weren't practical enough to pursue seriously. "Why did you stop?" Noel asked, his dark eyes focused entirely on me in a way that felt both thrilling and terrifying. "Life got complicated. Priorities shifted." "That's not really an answer. It's the only one I have right now." Noel set down his teacup deliberately, leaning forward slightly. "You overthink everything, don't you? I can see it happening. You process every word before you speak, calculate every response. It must be exhausting. If I don't think things through, I'll fall apart." "Why?" "'Cause that's what happens when you stop holding the pieces together." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. Noel reached across the small table and touched my hand briefly, just his fingertips against my knuckles, feather-light and careful. "Maybe falling apart is necessary sometimes. You can't rebuild something that's already broken unless you acknowledge it's broken first." His words hit somewhere deep, a place I'd been carefully avoiding. I looked at him, really looked, and saw no judgment in his expression. No disappointment, just understanding that felt like oxygen after years of suffocating. "This feeling," I whispered, barely audible. "Is this normal? Feeling this comfortable with someone I barely know? I think maybe that means you're not comfortable with the people you've known for years." The truth of it stole my breath. My phone rang, shattering the moment. Paul's name flashed on the screen. I answered with a sense of dread settling in my stomach. "Where are you?" "I came home early." "Dinner's not ready." "I'm at a bookstore." "Which one?" His tone carried that edge I knew too well, suspicion masquerading as casual interest. "Just one downtown." A pause that stretched too long. "Fine. I'll order takeout." The call ended without a goodbye. "No, I miss you." "No, when will you be home?" Just the dial tone and the realization that I felt nothing. No guilt. No anxiety. No desperate need to rush home and smooth things over. For the first time in 3 years, his disappointment didn't hollow me out. Noel was watching me carefully. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," I said, and it wasn't entirely a lie. "Everything's fine." We stayed at the bookshop until they announced closing time. Long after the tea had gone cold and Marble had abandoned my lap for more productive napping locations. When we finally stepped outside, the evening air felt different, charged with something I couldn't quite name. "Same time next week?" Noel asked, hands shoved in his jacket pockets. "I'd like that." As I walked home through streets painted orange by streetlights, my phone buzzed repeatedly. Messages from Noel, a photo of the sunset, a joke about how Marble was clearly plotting world domination, a simple "thanks for today." I responded to each one, smiling at my phone like a teenager. And for those few blocks, I forgot about the apartment waiting for me. Forgot about Paul's silent treatment. Forgot about the engagement ring that felt heavier with each passing day. When I finally climbed the stairs to our floor, I paused outside the door. I could hear the television through the wall. Some documentary about financial markets that Paul loved and I'd always found mind-numbing. Inside that apartment was my life as I'd constructed it, safe and suffocating in equal measure. I stood there for a full minute before turning the key, preparing to step back into the role I'd been playing. But something had shifted. The mask didn't fit quite as well anymore, and I was starting to wonder if I wanted to keep wearing it. The next week dissolved into a pattern that felt both dangerous and necessary. Noel and I met almost daily. Coffee shops, art galleries, a photography exhibit where he explained composition techniques, while I pretended to understand aperture settings. Each meeting chipped away at the carefully constructed walls I'd built around myself. He never asked directly about my personal life, but his curiosity showed in gentler ways. When I mentioned needing to leave by 6, he simply nodded. When my phone rang and I silenced it without checking, he changed the subject. He was giving me space to exist without explanation, and that generosity felt revolutionary. One evening, after we'd spent hours wandering through the museum district, Noel walked me partway home. We stopped on a quiet sidewalk corner where streetlights cast long shadows and the distant sound of traffic felt like white noise. "Thank you," I said suddenly, "for these past few weeks, for just being easy to talk to." "You don't have to thank me for enjoying your company, Simon." The way he said my name, with such casual warmth, made my chest tighten. We stood there facing each other and I saw him debate something internally before stepping forward and pulling me into an embrace. It was meant to be friendly, a simple goodbye hug between friends. But it lasted several seconds longer than necessary. His arms solid and reassuring around me. His heartbeat steady against my cheek. I let myself sink into it. Let myself accept comfort I'd been denying myself for months. What I didn't notice was Paul's car parked half a block away, engine running, headlights off. What I didn't see was him watching through the windshield, his jaw clenched and hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. When I finally pulled back from Noel's embrace and we said our goodnights, I walked the remaining 3 blocks home with a lightness I hadn't felt in years. I was still smiling when I unlocked the apartment door. Paul stood in the center of the living room, still wearing his coat, arms folded across his chest like a barrier. His face was flushed with barely contained rage. Who was that? The question hit me like cold water. Who was who? The man who just had his arms around you. On the street, where anyone could see, my mind raced, calculating responses and discarding them. I removed my jacket slowly, buying time. A friend. A friend. Paul laughed without humor, taking a step closer. You embrace your friends like that. Look at them the way you were looking at him. Paul, you're overreacting. Am I? His voice rose sharply. You disappear for hours every day, come home smiling at your phone, and now I find out you're letting strange men hold you in public? Are you cheating on me, Simon? Something inside me snapped, the final thread of patience I'd been clinging to for months. Years, maybe. Cheating? My voice came out louder than I'd intended. Months of suppressed frustration finally finding release. You haven't touched me in half a year. You don't talk to me except to criticize. You've turned me into a decoration you trot out for your business dinners, and then ignore the rest of the time. I'm not a person to you anymore, I'm a prop. Paul stared at me, clearly shocked. He'd never heard me raise my voice, never seen me push back. I'm miserable, I continued, my voice shaking but steady. I've been miserable for so long I forgot what happiness felt like. And you know the worst part? You never even noticed. You never miss if I was okay, if I needed anything, if I wanted to talk. All you care about is whether I make you look good. That's not fair. Fair? Tears were streaming down my face now, but I didn't bother wiping them away. What's not fair is proposing to someone and then spending 3 years erasing who they are. What's not fair is making me feel guilty for having a friend who actually listens when I speak. What's not fair is standing there acting betrayed when you checked out of this relationship months ago. The silence that followed was deafening. Paul's expression cycled through shock, hurt, and finally a cold hardness I'd never seen before. Fine. He walked to the bedroom, movements jerky with suppressed emotion. I heard drawers opening, the sound of a zipper. He emerged minutes later with an overnight bag. I'm staying at my parents' house for a few days. You should think about what you really want, Simon, because clearly this isn't it. The door closed behind him with a finality that echoed through the suddenly empty apartment. I stood frozen for several heartbeats before my legs gave out. I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the floor, knees drawn to my chest, and finally let myself break completely. The sobs came from somewhere deep and primal, years of swallowed disappointment and crushed dreams finally forcing their way out. I cried until my throat was raw and my eyes swollen, until I had no tears left and could only sit there shaking with dry heaves. My phone buzzed against the floor where it had fallen. Through blurred vision I saw Noel's name. Did you get home safely? Just want to make sure you're all right. I couldn't respond. Couldn't find words to explain what had just happened. I turned the phone face down and pulled my knees tighter against my chest, making myself as small as possible in the wreckage of my relationship. Outside, the city continued its evening rhythm. Cars passing, neighbors' muffled conversations, someone's television playing too loud. Life went on, oblivious to the fact that mine had just imploded. I must have sat there for hours. Eventually my muscles cramped and forced me to move. I stumbled to the bathroom, caught sight of my reflection. Red eyes, blotchy skin, hair disheveled, and barely recognized myself. Who was this person? When had I become someone who cried on bathroom floors over a relationship I'd stopped wanting? My phone buzzed again. This time it was Mrs. Lauren. Paul called. Very upset. Are you okay, dear? Please let me know you're safe. At least someone cared whether I was safe. I typed back, "I'm okay. We'll explain later. Thank you for checking." That night, I slept on the couch, unable to face the bedroom that smelled like Paul's cologne and broken promises. As I finally drifted into fitful sleep, I realized something that should have terrified me but instead felt oddly liberating. I didn't want him to come back. The first day without Paul felt like floating in zero gravity, unmoored and disorienting, but strangely peaceful. I didn't get out of bed until noon, and even then only because my body demanded water. The apartment felt different in his absence, like it had exhaled for the first time in months. I didn't eat properly. A handful of crackers, half an apple that tasted like cardboard. My phone remained silent. No calls from Paul, no angry texts, nothing. The silence should have hurt, but instead it confirmed what I already knew. He didn't miss me. He missed the idea of me, the convenient partner who made him look stable and settled. By the second day, I'd moved from numb acceptance to restless energy. I cleaned obsessively, scrubbing away invisible dirt, reorganizing shelves that didn't need organizing. Anything to avoid thinking about the future stretching ahead like blank canvas. On the third morning, Mrs. Lauren called. "Simon, sweetheart, can we meet, please? I need to see with my own eyes that you're all right." We arranged to meet at the same cafe where she'd first shared her story with me. When I arrived, she was already there, worry lines creasing her forehead. She stood and embraced me immediately, holding on like I might disappear. "Paul told me his version of events," she said once we'd settled with our coffees. "But I want to hear yours. The truth, not whatever narrative he's constructed." So I told her everything. The weeks of silence, meeting Noel, the growing realization that I'd been performing happiness rather than living it, the confrontation, Paul's accusation, my breakdown. She listened without interrupting, her hand occasionally squeezing mine across the table. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "I'm proud of you," she finally said. "Proud?" I laughed bitterly. "My engagement just imploded. I yelled at your son. I'm a mess. You found your voice. After years of being silenced, you finally stood up for yourself. That takes tremendous courage." She leaned forward intently. "Simon, listen to me. This feels like an ending, but it's actually a beginning. Your real life is starting now. The one where you get to be yourself completely, not some edited version designed to fit someone else's expectations. But everything's ruined. 3 years, all the plans, all the people who thought we were perfect together. The people who truly care about you will understand. The rest? Their opinions never mattered in the first place." She gripped my hand tighter. "You deserve a life that makes you excited to wake up in the morning. You deserve someone who celebrates who you are rather than trying to reshape you. Don't settle for less just because it's familiar." Her words cracked something open inside me, but this time the tears felt different. Lighter, like releasing pressure rather than drowning in it. "What do I do now?" I asked, my voice small. "You live, you paint, you make choices based on what you want instead of what you think you should want. You give yourself permission to be happy." We sat together until our coffees went cold, talking about practical things: where I'd live if Paul demanded I move out, whether I needed legal advice about the engagement ring, how to handle mutual friends. She promised to support whatever decisions I made, even if it meant acknowledging her son's role in this disaster. When we finally hugged goodbye outside the cafe, I felt steadier than I had in days. My phone rang as I walked away. Noel's name appeared on the screen, and I answered before I could overthink it. "Simon, are you okay? I've been worried. You went silent and I thought maybe I'm okay," I interrupted gently. "I promise. Things got complicated, but I'm handling it." A pause, then carefully, "Do you want to talk about it? We could meet for coffee. No pressure, only if you want to." I stopped walking and looked up at the sky. It was brilliantly blue, not a single cloud visible, the kind of perfect autumn day that felt like a gift. "Yes," I said. "I'd like that. I need that actually." "Same cafe as usual? I can be there in 20 minutes. I'll be there." When I arrived, Noel was already outside, pacing slightly. The moment he saw me, relief flooded his expression. He moved toward me instinctively, then stopped himself. clearly unsure whether I wanted comfort or space. I closed the distance between us. I ended things with Paul, I said simply. Or maybe he ended things with me. Either way, it's over. Simon, I'm so sorry if I caused problems between you. You didn't cause anything. You just helped me see what I'd been ignoring for years. I managed a small smile. Thank you for being worried. For checking on me. For just caring. Of course I care. He said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world. And maybe it should have been. Maybe that was the problem all along. I'd forgotten that caring was supposed to be effortless. We went inside and claimed our usual corner table. I told him an abbreviated version of what had happened, leaving out the messiest emotional details, but being honest about where I was. Single, confused, terrified, but also oddly hopeful. What happens now? Noel asked. I have no idea. I'm making this up as I go. I looked at him directly, needing him to understand. I'm not ready for anything new. I need time to figure out who I am when I'm not trying to be what someone else needs. That's completely fair. And for what it's worth, I like the version of you I've gotten to know these past weeks. The one who laughs at terrible jokes and gets passionate about color theory and stays up late debating whether free will exists. That person is pretty remarkable exactly as he is. Something in my chest loosened. A knot I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. Can we still be friends? I know that's asking a lot. Simon. He reached across the table and squeezed my hand briefly. I'm not going anywhere. Take all the time you need. I'll be here. We stayed at that cafe for hours, the conversation flowing easily from heavy topics to lighter ones. He showed me photos from his latest project, street photography, capturing ordinary people in extraordinary light. I described paintings I wanted to create, ideas I'd been suppressing for years. When we finally left, the sun was setting in shades of orange and pink that looked like hope painted across the sky. Noel walked me to the corner where we usually parted ways. Are you going to be okay tonight? He asked. Alone in the apartment? Yeah. I think I will be. And surprisingly, I meant it. For the first time in years, I was facing a future without a script, without someone else's expectations dictating my choices. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Good night, Simon. Text me if you need anything. Even just to talk. I will. Thank you, Noel. For everything. I walked the remaining blocks alone. But I didn't feel lonely. I felt present. Alive. Ready to discover who I could become when I stopped trying to be someone I wasn't. The apartment was dark when I entered, but I didn't turn on all the lights. I went to the spare room where my art supplies had been gathering dust and pulled out my easel, set up a fresh canvas, selected brushes and paints I'd forgotten I owned. And then, for the first time in 3 years, I began to paint.